The morning began like any other. Gray skies, cold wind, and a woman too tired to dream. Her coat was worn thin, her hands trembling as she counted coins on a cafe counter. She didn't have enough for her own coffee, yet she quietly paid for the man behind her, a stranger with weary eyes. No one noticed the small act. But the next morning the entire neighborhood did, because when the sun rose, the sound of spinning blades filled the air, and a helicopter landed in front of her tiny house. Something extraordinary was about to happen to the woman who had lost faith in miracles. Each morning began in darkness, long before the sun touched the cracked rooftops of the small town. The man moved quietly through the silence, careful not to wake the little boy sleeping in the next room. The walls of their rented apartment were thin, the kind that echoed every sigh, every prayer whispered into the night. His name was Daniel, a man in his late 30s whose eyes carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned to survive on less sleep, less comfort, less hope. Outside, the streets were still damp from the night's rain. Daniel's old pickup groaned as it started, coughing out smoke like a tired animal. He worked as a janitor at the local high school, a job that didn't ask much of him beyond showing up, cleaning, and disappearing before the students arrived. But for Daniel, every paycheck meant another week of meals, another month of rent, another reason his son could keep dreaming. The boy's name was Leo, only 7, with a face that still believed the world was kind. He was the light in Daniel's otherwise dim life, the laugh that filled the small apartment, the reason Daniel endured every insult and every aching shift. Mornings were for work, nights for Leo's homework, and somewhere in between, Daniel found moments to breathe, even if just to watch his son sleep beneath a blanket patched with fading stars. He wasn't always alone. There was a time when laughter filled the house from 2 voices instead of 1. Leo's mother had been warmth itself, until illness took her like a shadow swallowing the last bit of daylight. Daniel never spoke of her to anyone, but sometimes when the boy smiled just right, Daniel would catch himself whispering her name in his thoughts. Like a prayer that refused to fade, bills piled up faster than he could pay them. Some days he skipped his own meals to keep food on Leo's plate. His hands, once steady, had grown rough and cracked, the skin peeling from long hours spent scrubbing floors and hauling trash. Yet no one saw the quiet dignity in his work, the man who showed up early and stayed late, who carried sadness like a secret he refused to burden anyone with. Evenings were the hardest. The school hallways emptied, lights dimmed, and Daniel pushed his mop through corridors lined with laughter he no longer shared. He'd pause by the trophy case sometimes, staring at the gold reflections of achievements he never had the chance to chase. Then when the clock struck 9, he'd drive home under the dim glow of streetlights, passing the cafe where people sat laughing, unaware of the man watching from behind a windshield fogged by exhaustion. Leo would always be waiting by the window when he returned. Daniel could see the boy's face pressed against the glass, a mixture of relief and joy, as if his father had just come back from war. Inside, the smell of instant noodles filled the air. Leo's school drawings decorated the fridge, bright, colorful sketches of houses, trees, and a man holding a boy's hand. To anyone else, they were simple doodles. To Daniel, they were proof that love, even in poverty, could still feel abundant. On weekends, Daniel took Leo to the park near the river. The 2 of them would sit on a bench overlooking the water, throwing pieces of stale bread to ducks that never seemed to care where they came from. Leo would giggle, his small hands covered in crumbs, and Daniel would smile faintly, hiding the fear that one day even these small joys might slip away. The rent was overdue again. His boss had hinted that the school might cut hours, and still, Daniel kept his shoulders straight, pretending strength he didn't always feel. At night, when Leo slept, Daniel would sit by the window staring at the flickering lights of the city. He often wondered if life would ever change, if kindness still had a place in a world that seemed so indifferent. He'd think about his wife, the warmth of her hand, the softness of her voice, and then glance at the photo by the bedside table. It was cracked, but he never replaced it. Somehow that imperfection made it more real. He had grown used to the quiet ache of being unseen. The world rarely noticed men like him, those who gave everything just to keep one small heart safe. But soon, Daniel's life was about to change in a way that neither he nor his son could ever imagine. Because sometimes fate begins not with thunder or fire, but with a simple, unremarkable moment, the kind that most people overlook. And for Daniel, that moment would come on an ordinary morning, in an ordinary cafe, when a stranger would walk into his life, and unknowingly, rewrite it forever. It began with the rain, the kind that didn't just fall. It lingered, soaking the ground until it seemed even the earth couldn't hold any more sorrow. Daniel stood beneath the thin awning of the small cafe, shivering in his faded work jacket. The smell of roasted coffee and fresh pastries spilled into the street, mingling with the damp chill. It was payday, or at least what was left of it. Half would go to rent, the other half to groceries that might last the week if he was careful. There was barely enough left for a coffee, yet for some reason he stepped inside. The cafe was warm, golden light bouncing off the glass display cases, steam curling from the machines like quiet breath. Daniel hesitated before ordering the cheapest drink, counting his crumpled bills with the care of a man who could not afford mistakes. Behind him, a man in a tailored coat spoke to someone on the phone, his tone sharp, his words hurried, his presence commanding. Daniel didn't look up until he noticed the stranger's wallet slip from his coat pocket and fall to the floor. It landed near Daniel's boot. He bent down, instinctively picking it up. The leather was soft, new, nothing like the torn one he carried in his back pocket. For a moment, Daniel thought about calling out, but the man was already stepping outside, lost in his call. Daniel moved to follow him, but the rain had grown heavier, and by the time he reached the door, the stranger had disappeared into the blur of traffic. He stared at the wallet in his hands. Inside were several credit cards, a driver's license, and thick folds of cash, more than Daniel had seen in years. He froze. The logical part of him whispered that he should take it to the police, maybe turn it in tomorrow when he had time. But another part, the weary, desperate part, felt the ache of hunger, of overdue bills, of the child who sometimes asked why their fridge was always half empty. He slipped the wallet into his jacket, guilt already forming like a knot in his chest. That night, the wind howled outside their window as Leo slept beside the flickering light of a small lamp. Daniel sat at the table, the wallet resting before him like a test he hadn't studied for. He thought of his son's shoes with torn soles, the unpaid electricity bill tucked beneath a pile of unopened letters. Every reason to keep the money whispered softly in his ear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. His conscience was louder than hunger. The next morning he woke with resolve. He'd return it. It didn't matter what the stranger had or didn't have. What mattered was what Daniel would lose if he didn't do the right thing. His peace, his son's respect, the last fragment of himself that still believed in good. He took Leo to school, promising they'd have a big dinner that night. Then he went to the cafe and asked the barista if she recognized the man's name from the license. She didn't. Disappointed but determined, Daniel decided to visit the address on the card, a location miles away, far beyond the part of town he knew. The house was enormous, a mansion hidden behind iron gates, the kind of place Daniel had only seen on television. He hesitated at the intercom, soaking wet, clutching the wallet like an artifact from another world. When the gate opened and a voice told him to come in, he half expected it to be a mistake. The man from the cafe greeted him at the door, his expression puzzled. Daniel handed over the wallet, muttering an apology that no one heard. The stranger, clearly relieved, nodded and took it with little more than a polite thank you. It was over in seconds. No reward, no conversation. Just an awkward moment between two men from different worlds. Daniel turned to leave, feeling oddly empty, when the man called out, not in words but in tone. He said something Daniel couldn't quite catch, his voice softer, uncertain. But Daniel didn't look back. That night, Daniel came home to find Leo coloring at the kitchen table. There was no dinner yet, just the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the quiet hope in his son's eyes. He smiled, pretending everything was fine, but something inside him ached deeper than usual. He had done the right thing, but why did it feel like loss? Days passed. Work remained the same. Long hours, aching knees, a paycheck that barely stretched far enough. But something was different. Each morning, Daniel noticed a black SUV parked near the school. Sometimes it was there when he dropped off Leo. Other times when he came home. He dismissed it as coincidence until one afternoon, a man in a suit approached him as he finished mopping the school hallway. The man introduced himself as an assistant of the gentleman whose wallet he had returned. He handed Daniel an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. Daniel's breath caught when he saw the amount. It was more than a year's salary. His first instinct was disbelief. His second was refusal. He didn't earn this. But the note said something that made him pause. You gave back what wasn't yours when no one was watching. I've spent a lifetime surrounded by people who only give when someone's looking. Let me help you now. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stared at the check, torn between pride and relief. He thought about how much it could change their lives, how Leo could finally have what he deserved. Yet something about it felt too unreal, too heavy. It wasn't just money, it was a door. One he wasn't sure he had the right to open. He deposited part of it quietly, using it to pay overdue bills and buy new shoes for Leo. For the first time in years, they had a proper meal, a real dinner with laughter and light. But as weeks passed, small changes began to ripple through their lives. Daniel noticed more cars parked near their building, people whispering when he passed. Then one morning, Leo came home from school with a flyer. It was a photo of the wealthy man, alongside a news headline. Philanthropist seeks the man who returned his lost wallet. Daniel's heart sank. His anonymity was gone. Reporters began showing up near the school, asking questions. His coworkers looked at him differently, some with admiration, others with suspicion. The quiet life he had fought so hard to protect was unraveling. When he tried to contact the man to refuse further attention, no one answered. But the next day, a helicopter appeared above their building. The sound was deafening, rattling the windows. Neighbors ran outside. Leo pressed his face to the window in awe. And as the helicopter landed in the nearby field, Daniel realized the man wasn't just repaying a favor. He was about to change everything. Two men stepped out, followed by the stranger himself. He looked different now, less polished, more human. He approached Daniel, hand extended, and though no words were exchanged, something passed between them. Understanding, respect, and something else. An offer. The next days blurred into something dreamlike. Daniel was invited to meet at the man's foundation headquarters. The place was filled with photos of community projects, schools, hospitals, shelters. The man explained, through quiet gestures and handwritten notes, that he wanted Daniel to join him, to manage outreach for struggling families. Someone who knows what it's like, the note read. Daniel hesitated. He had no experience, no education beyond high school, but the man smiled faintly and pointed to his heart, as if to say, that's what matters. That night, Daniel sat by Leo's bed watching him sleep. The hum of the city outside felt different now, full of possibility. Yet beneath the hope was fear. What if this was too good to last? What if the world took it away as easily as it had given? He remembered his wife's last words, soft, trembling, telling him to raise their boy to be kind no matter what life took from them. Maybe this was the chance to honor that. As dawn crept through the blinds, Daniel stood at the window again, the same one where he had once felt invisible. Now, a helicopter's echo still lingered in his ears, a sound that had marked the turning point of his story. The man who once cleaned other people's messes was standing at the edge of a new beginning. But what Daniel didn't know yet was that kindness, his simple, quiet kindness, was about to test him again. Because gifts, no matter how generous, always come with shadows. And soon he'd discover that sometimes the hardest part of being lifted up isn't believing you deserve it. It's holding on when life tries to pull you back down. It came without warning, the call that would change everything again. Daniel was at the community center, helping unpack supplies for families displaced by the floods. The place buzzed with life and gratitude. Laughter echoed where despair once lived. It had been months since that rainy morning in the cafe, and life had found a new rhythm. The foundation job had not only paid the bills, but filled Daniel with a quiet pride. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like his story had finally turned a page. But as he stacked boxes against the wall, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. A nurse's voice on the other end trembled as she spoke Leo's name. Daniel didn't hear the rest. The world simply stopped. The sound of people talking, the hum of traffic outside, it all blurred into silence. He dropped the box, his hands suddenly numb, his breath gone. The next moments unfolded like a dream he couldn't wake from. Rain lashed against the hospital windows as Daniel ran down sterile hallways, his heart pounding so violently it hurt to breathe. When he reached the small emergency room, he saw his son, still pale, fragile, lying beneath a tangle of wires and machines. A doctor explained something about a car accident, a driver losing control near the school. The words fell like stones. Daniel sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing back to every morning he'd told Leo to look both ways, every promise he'd made to keep him safe. Now, the boy who once ran into his arms after school lay motionless beneath cold fluorescent light. Daniel reached out, trembling, touching his son's hand, the same hand that once held crayons in dreams. It was cold, yet still his. He whispered in his heart, please, bargains, anything for one more smile. Memories flooded in, late-night stories, laughter over burnt toast, the way Leo's small hand used to tug at his sleeve when he was scared. He had faced hunger, loneliness, humiliation, but this was the one thing he could not bear. Hours passed in fragments. The wealthy man from the cafe, the one who had become his friend and mentor, arrived, silent but steady. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his eyes saying what words could not. You are not alone. But Daniel barely registered it. His entire world lay on that hospital bed, fighting for breath. As night fell, Daniel stood by the window, rain streaking the glass. He thought about the path that had led him here, all the pain, all the miracles, all the kindness he'd received. He had been given a new life, a second chance. But what good was it if he lost the only reason he had fought so hard to survive? He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, tears mixing with rain, and for the first time in years, he let himself break. The doctor's voice interrupted the silence, soft, hesitant. They needed to move Leo to a larger facility for surgery, one that could give him a fighting chance. But the cost was staggering, far beyond what Daniel could afford, even now. The foundation had limits, the hospital had policies, and time was running out. Daniel's heart pounded. He had always been the man who gave, never the one who begged. But pride had no place here. He turned to the wealthy man beside him and bowed his head, not with words, but with a look of pure, wordless desperation. The man nodded. There was no hesitation, just quiet understanding. He made the call. Within an hour, the sound of rotors filled the air again. The same helicopter that had once brought hope now became the sound of fear. Nurses rushed to prepare Leo for transfer. Daniel held his son's small hand as the stretcher was wheeled out, every second cutting deeper. The night sky opened above them, heavy and endless, as they climbed aboard. From above, the city looked like a blur of light and shadow. Beautiful, distant, fragile. Inside the helicopter, Daniel watched Leo's chest rise and fall beneath the oxygen mask. He remembered the first time he held him. Tiny, warm, the last gift his wife had left behind. He remembered her final words. Promise me he'll never feel alone. And as the blades roared above them, Daniel realized that love had always been the quiet strength inside him, the force that had carried him through every storm. The hospital in the city was brighter, colder, faster. Doctors moved like shadows, voices urgent but distant. Daniel sat outside the surgery room, his hands clasped, his body trembling with exhaustion. The wealthy man stayed beside him the entire night, not as a benefactor, but as something else, someone who understood what it meant to lose and still hope. As dawn approached, Daniel's thoughts wandered to all the people he'd met through the foundation. The single mothers, the widowed fathers, the children who had lost everything but still found ways to smile. He had helped them find hope, not realizing he'd need it more than anyone. Maybe this was the true test, not of faith, but of surrender. The door opened at sunrise. The surgeon stepped out, eyes weary. There were no words at first, only the weight of silence that filled the corridor. Daniel's heart sank before he even heard the verdict. The surgery had gone well, but the next 24 hours would decide everything. Leo's heart was weak, his body fragile. "He's fighting," the doctor said, "but he'll need all the strength you can give him." Daniel walked into the recovery room, the morning light spilling over the bed where Leo lay. The machines beeped softly, steady but fragile. Daniel sat beside him, brushing the boy's hair from his forehead. For the first time in days, he smiled, not because he believed everything would be fine, but because he finally understood something. His wife had tried to teach him long ago. Love isn't about control. It's about showing up when the world falls apart. He closed his eyes and began to pray, not for miracles, but for peace. The wealthy man watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, until finally, he stepped forward and placed something on the table beside the bed. It was a folded envelope. Daniel opened it later when the room was quiet, and inside was a single line written in careful handwriting. "You gave me back my wallet, but what you really returned was my faith in humanity. Let me return something greater. Your future." Inside was a document transferring ownership of the foundation to Daniel. Every project, every outreach program, his to lead. Daniel's hands trembled. It wasn't a gift, it was trust, legacy, redemption. He looked at his son, at the fragile rise and fall of his small chest, and knew what he had to do. Whether Leo woke or not, he would spend the rest of his life giving back the way life had given to him. Hours passed. The monitors hummed softly, steady. Daniel sat there holding Leo's hand, whispering silently to the boy who had changed him. Then for a moment the beeping slowed. Nurses rushed in, voices rising. Daniel stood frozen, every muscle locked in terror as the monitor flatlined. Time fractured. The world vanished into a single sound, the piercing tone of loss. Daniel's knees gave way, his body collapsing beside the bed. The doctors worked frantically, voices sharp and distant, and in that unbearable stillness he felt everything, fear, love, despair, converge into one silent plea. Then a gasp, a flicker on the monitor. The line rose again, weak but alive. The room exhaled. Daniel did too, collapsing forward in tears. His hands covered his face as sobs broke free, raw and unrestrained. He had never known such pain, nor such relief. But even in that moment, as sunlight began to pour through the window, one truth echoed through his heart. No matter what happened next, he was already changed. He had lost everything once, only to find that love, the real kind, doesn't end when life gets hard. It endures. It rebuilds. It forgives. And as Leo's fingers twitched faintly in his grasp, Daniel realized that the hardest battles are fought not with strength, but with faith that refuses to die. Yet outside that fragile room a storm was gathering, one that would test everything he had just learned. The gift he'd been given, the trust he now held, the new life he was promised. Soon, he would discover that even miracles come with a price. And this time, the price would be far greater than he ever imagined. The sun rose slowly that morning, as if the world itself had decided to take a deep breath before beginning again. The light spilled softly across the hospital room, painting the walls in gold. Machines still hummed quietly, but the frantic rhythm of the night before had faded into calm. Daniel sat beside Leo's bed, his hand still holding the boy's. Warm now, alive, steady. Sleep had escaped him, but he didn't need it. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what the next hour might bring. Leo stirred, his eyes fluttering open, weak but curious, the way children always are after surviving something they shouldn't have had to face. Daniel smiled through tears he didn't bother to hide. The boy's heart had fought back, and so had his days turned into weeks. Leo's strength returned slowly, like the tide reclaiming the shore. The wealthy man, his unexpected guardian angel, visited often, always quiet, always keeping his distance, as if knowing this was a chapter Daniel and his son needed to finish together. The foundation's paperwork was complete now. Daniel was its new head, a man who once mopped floors now overseeing programs that fed, clothed, and sheltered thousands. But Daniel didn't change overnight. He still woke before dawn, still made breakfast the same way, still whispered small prayers into his coffee before the day began. Only now there was gratitude instead of worry. There was peace where once there had been panic. The foundation grew beyond anything he had imagined. It became a beacon in the community, a place where single parents found food, education, and hope. Daniel often visited families who reminded him of himself, tired but unbroken, lost but still searching. He listened to their stories, not as a savior, but as someone who had walked the same dark road and survived. Each time he handed out a meal, a blanket, or a scholarship, he remembered the night his son almost slipped away. He remembered what it meant to be held by grace when you had nothing left to give. Leo grew stronger with each passing month. He laughed more, drew more, filled their small apartment with sketches of the world he wanted to see. Trees, oceans, cities filled with people helping one another. Daniel framed each one, lining their hallway with color and hope. One drawing stood out among the rest. Two figures standing under a helicopter, sunlight bursting through the clouds. In the corner, Leo had written, "The day the sky came down to help us." On the anniversary of that day, Daniel returned to the cafe where it had all begun. The rain was falling again, soft, steady, cleansing. He stood by the same counter, now with steadier hands and eyes that no longer darted to count every coin. The barista recognized him, offered a smile, and without a word handed him a coffee on the house. He stepped outside, the warmth of the cup in his palms, and looked up at the sky. The sound of rain was gentler now, almost like applause. He thought of his wife, the way she used to laugh at storms, saying they reminded her that even the heavens needed to cry sometimes. Daniel smiled at the memory, not with sadness, but with gratitude. She was gone, yes, but she had never really left. Her love had been the thread stitching every broken piece of his story together. Later that day, he took Leo to the park by the river, the same one they used to visit when the world felt too heavy. The ducks were still there, the same old bench waiting. Leo ran ahead, laughing, tossing breadcrumbs into the water, his voice carrying through the air like music. Daniel sat down, watching him, and realized something quietly profound. Happiness wasn't something that arrived in a helicopter or a check. It was this, small moments that asked for nothing but presence. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Daniel pulled from his pocket a small, worn-out wallet, the same one that had started everything. The leather was cracked now, the edges frayed, but he kept it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest act, a choice made without expectation, can ripple through the world like light through rain. He placed the wallet on the bench beside him for a moment, closed his eyes and let the cool breeze wash over him. He could almost hear his wife's voice in the wind, soft and proud. "You did it." When Leo came running back, his face flushed with joy, Daniel opened his arms. The boy jumped into them, laughing, the sound pure and unfiltered. In that embrace, everything made sense. The struggle, the loss, the miracles. Every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer had led to this one simple truth. Love was never wasted. It always found its way back, one way or another. As they walked home, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, glowing like stars drawn down to earth. Daniel looked up, remembering the night sky above the hospital, the line that had gone flat and the pulse that had returned. Life, fragile as it was, had given him another chance, and as he carried his son on his shoulders, their laughter echoing down the quiet street, Daniel finally understood what his journey had been about. It wasn't about luck or charity or fate. It was about grace, the kind that arrives quietly, like rain, and teaches you to believe again. He stopped for a moment, watching Leo point at the sky. Someday, he thought, he'll understand. But for now, it was enough to walk beneath the streetlights. Two shadows merged into one, carrying everything that mattered. Behind them, the city hummed, alive with stories like theirs. Ordinary people holding on through extraordinary storms. And as the last drop of rain fell from the heavens, Daniel smiled, his heart full. Because sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from wealth or power or grand gestures. They come from the smallest moments of kindness, the ones that ask for nothing, yet change everything. And if you listened closely enough beneath the fading hum of the night, you could almost hear it, The quiet truth Daniel had lived to tell. Love doesn't always fix what's broken. Sometimes, it simply teaches us how to live beautifully with the cracks.